On the night of June 5, 1944, Gefreiter Heinrich Severloh sat in bunker WN-62 overlooking Omaha Beach, writing letters and cleaning his MG-42. 3 days earlier, Field Marshal Rommel had personally inspected his position. The Desert Fox, the man who'd humiliated the British in North Africa, had looked through Severloh's gun slit, examined the overlapping killing zones, and given an approving nod. Severloh carried a letter from his girlfriend, promising to wait for his victorious return. He'd written back with absolute confidence, "When they come, we'll throw them back into the sea within hours." This wasn't bravado. It was the conclusion any rational observer would draw from the defenses Germany had constructed. Consider what the Atlantic Wall represented. 2,400 miles of fortifications from Norway to Spain, consuming 17 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.2 million tons of steel. Hitler had called it impregnable, and the numbers at Omaha Beach alone seemed to justify that claim. 8 concrete bunkers, 35 pillboxes, 4 artillery batteries, 18 anti-tank positions, 45 rocket sites, 85 machine gun nests, and 6 mortar pits. The tidal approaches were studded with 3,700 obstacles, Belgian gates designed to rip open landing craft hulls, Czech hedgehogs that would impale any vehicle, wooden stakes topped with teller mines. Behind the beaches, 6.5 million mines had been planted, creating a lethal maze. Oberst Ernst Goth, commanding the 916th Grenadier Regiment, had run the calculations meticulously. His batteries could deliver 120 rounds per minute into the beach sectors. Combined with neighboring units, they could concentrate devastating firepower on any landing zone. The math was simple. Any invasion force would be annihilated in the surf before reaching dry sand. But these calculations contained a fatal flaw. They assumed Germany would have unlimited ammunition, functioning communications, air superiority, and the ability to move reserves freely. Within 24 hours, every single one of these assumptions would be shattered so completely that German soldiers would question their own sanity. The meteorological gamble that decided everything. Weather shaped the invasion in ways most histories overlook. On June 5th, Luftwaffe meteorologist Walter Stabe in Paris declared conditions impossible for invasion. Winds at 20 to 25 knots, 6-foot waves, 500-foot cloud ceiling. Using data from U-boats and weather stations across occupied Europe, Stabe confidently predicted at least 2 weeks of unsuitable weather. This forecast had massive consequences. Rommel left for Germany on June 5th to celebrate his wife's birthday, carrying gray suede shoes he'd purchased in Paris as a gift. General Dolman ordered division commanders to attend war games at Rennes. Even the Kriegsmarine canceled their usual channel patrols. The seas were too rough for small boats. The entire German command structure relaxed, convinced nature itself had granted them a reprieve. What Stabe couldn't know, what gave the Allies their decisive edge, was that British and American meteorologists had resources Germany lacked. Weather stations in Greenland provided Atlantic data German scientists never saw. Long-range weather reconnaissance flights gathered information from far beyond German reach. Group Captain James Stagg, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist, identified a narrow 36-hour window of marginally acceptable conditions forming in the Atlantic depression patterns. Eisenhower took the gamble. The German meteorologists, working with incomplete data, never saw it coming. The invasion succeeded partly because Allied weather forecasting was simply superior, a mundane technological advantage that translated into strategic surprise worth divisions of troops. At 11:15 p.m. on June 5th, German radar operators along the Norman coast detected massive aerial formations approaching. The Freya and Würzburg radar sets showed hundreds of aircraft, but operators had seen this pattern before. Allied deception raids designed to keep German forces on constant alert, degrading readiness through exhaustion. They didn't panic. They noted it in their logs and waited. By 12:30 a.m. on June 6th, reports began flooding in that defied logical interpretation. Fallschirmjäger paratroopers were dropping across Normandy, but the pattern made no tactical sense. Some units reported drops to the east near the Orne River, others to the west near Sainte-Mère-Église. Some claimed British paratroopers, others American. The drops seemed scattered, chaotic, almost random. German intelligence officers struggled to construct a coherent picture from contradictory reports. What they couldn't know was that much of what they were tracking wasn't real combat troops. Operations Titanic and Rupert had dropped hundreds of dummy paratroopers, burlap sacks and straw men rigged with firecrackers to simulate gunfire when they hit the ground. The Allies had deliberately created chaos, and it was working perfectly. Real paratroopers from the British 6th Airborne Division and American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were also scattered far from their intended drop zones. But this accident of execution became a strategic advantage. German units across Normandy were reporting enemy contact, creating the impression of airborne forces everywhere. Major Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 21st Panzer Division, was one of the few German officers who immediately understood what was happening. Awakened at 1:30 a.m. by reports of paratroopers landing near his positions east of Caen, he recognized the pattern. Airborne forces marking the flanks meant an amphibious assault was imminent. Every minute of delay gave the enemy time to organize. Von Luck immediately requested permission to counterattack and drive toward the coast, potentially crushing the paratroopers before they could consolidate. The response from division headquarters was devastating. "Stand by. Do not move until the situation clarifies. Further orders will follow." Von Luck would later write in his memoirs that he knew in that moment Germany had lost the battle. The rigid German command structure, which had worked brilliantly in earlier campaigns where communications remained intact, became a straitjacket. Initiative was punished. Officers waited for orders from superiors, who themselves were waiting for orders from above. Meanwhile, Allied paratroopers were digging in, setting up roadblocks, and preparing ambush positions. The 21st Panzer Division, the only significant armored force within striking distance of the beaches, sat immobile for critical hours because the command structure couldn't adapt to chaos.
5:30 a.m. As dawnlight began illuminating the English Channel, German observers in forward positions experienced something that decades later they still struggle to articulate. Lieutenant Frecking at WN-62 raised his binoculars and simply froze. What he saw violated everything he understood about military operations. The sea from horizon to horizon was covered with ships. Not dozens, not hundreds. The entire visible ocean was a carpet of steel. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport vessels, and landing craft beyond counting. 6,939 vessels according to Allied records. 1,213 warships. 4,126 landing craft, 736 support vessels, and 864 merchant ships. It was the largest naval armada ever assembled in human history, and it was coming directly at them. German soldiers had been raised on Nazi propaganda about Allied weakness, about how the decadent democracies lacked the will and organization to mount serious military operations. They had been told that Germany's ideological purity and martial spirit gave them inherent superiority. The sight of that armada shattered these beliefs instantly.
5:30 a.m. As dawn light began illuminating the English Channel, German observers in forward positions experienced something that decades later they still struggled to articulate. Lieutenant Frecking at WN-62 raised his binoculars and simply froze. What he saw violated everything he understood about military operations. The sea from horizon to horizon was covered with ships, not dozens, not hundreds. The entire visible ocean was a carpet of steel. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport vessels, and landing craft beyond counting. 6,939 139 vessels, according to Allied records, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 support vessels, and 864 merchant ships. It was the largest naval armada ever assembled in human history, and it was coming directly at them. German soldiers had been raised on Nazi propaganda about Allied weakness, about how the decadent democracies lacked the will and organization to mount serious military operations. They'd been told that Germany's ideological purity and martial spirit gave them inherent superiority. The sight of that armada shattered these beliefs instantly. This wasn't weakness. This represented industrial and organizational capacity that exceeded German comprehension. Frecking reportedly told his men, "The whole world is coming to our doorstep." He would be dead within hours, killed by naval gunfire that pulverized his position. 5:35 a.m. The naval bombardment began at 5:35 a.m., and it represented a form of warfare German soldiers had never encountered. The battleship USS Texas alone fired 255 14-inch shells, each weighing 1,500 pounds at Point du Hoc, in just 34 minutes. HMS Warspite delivered over 315 15-inch shells in the first 2 days. The French cruiser Georges Laigs fired 500 rounds from her 152mm guns. Destroyers steamed close to shore, sometimes in water so shallow they risked grounding, to deliver pinpoint fire support. The cumulative weight of fire exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had experienced. Eastern Front veterans, who'd survived Stalingrad, who thought they'd seen the worst warfare could offer, were psychologically broken by the bombardment. The volume of fire was industrial, not aimed at achieving specific tactical effects, but at systematically destroying everything in targeted zones. Concrete bunkers designed to withstand direct hits from the heaviest artillery began cracking. Men were buried alive when ceilings collapsed, dug out by their comrades, then buried again when the next salvo arrived. The psychological impact matched the physical destruction. These fortifications they'd trusted absolutely, that they'd been told were impregnable, were crumbling like sandcastles. And the shells kept coming. No pause, no end. The guns didn't run out of ammunition, they just kept firing, hour after hour, representing industrial capacity that seemed infinite compared to Germany's carefully rationed supplies. Joseph Pips Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, received orders at dawn to attack the invasion fleet with his entire force. His response, recorded in the war diary, captures the desperation of Germany's situation. What entire force? I have 2 operational aircraft. The Luftwaffe, which in 1940 had darkened the skies over France and Britain, which had been promised as an invincible shield, could muster exactly 319 sorties on D-Day. The Allies flew 14,674. The disparity was so complete that it almost defied comprehension. Priller and his wingmen, Heinz, made the only Luftwaffe attack on the beaches during the morning. Flying their Focke-Wulf 19s at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, they screamed over Sword Beach, strafed once, and fled before Allied fighter cover could intercept them. They claimed no kills. They were simply 2 men, making a futile gesture against thousands. German soldiers looking up at skies that should have been filled with friendly aircraft, instead saw endless formations of Allied bombers and fighters completely unopposed. The psychological impact was devastating. They'd been abandoned by the Air Force that was supposed to protect them. The Luftwaffe's absence reflected years of strategic failure. Germany had prioritized bomber production over fighters, then lost those bombers over Britain. They'd failed to develop long-range fighters or adequate pilot training programs. They'd scattered their forces across multiple fronts. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe had been bled white. It existed on paper, but was effectively destroyed as a fighting force.
6:30 a.m. The first assault waves hit the beaches at 6:30 a.m., and despite the bombardment, German defenders who could still move manned their positions. Heinrich Severloh's bunker WN-62 had survived the naval barrage relatively intact. His MG-42 commanded perfect fields of fire across Omaha Beach's E1 draw. At 6:35 a.m., he opened fire. For the next 9 hours, he would fire in disciplined bursts, 13,500 rounds according to his later memoir. Though the specific casualties he inflicted can never be verified in the chaos of Omaha Beach. What is certain is that Omaha became a slaughterhouse. The initial assault waves were decimated. Bodies piled up at the waterline, landing craft burned, the surf turned pink with blood. For a few hours, it looked like German defensive doctrine might actually work, that concentrated firepower from prepared positions could stop an amphibious assault. But then something psychologically devastating happened to the German defenders. No matter how many Americans fell, more kept coming. Every destroyed landing craft was replaced by 3 more. Every suppressed machine gun position came back to life. The waves of attackers were infinite, backed by naval gunfire that seemed unlimited. Military historians call this material shock, the psychological breakdown that occurs when soldiers confront overwhelming force that exceeds their capacity to process. German soldiers had fought on the Eastern Front, had experienced desperate battles where casualties mounted horrifically, but this was different. This wasn't desperation. This was industrial warfare, methodical, inexorable, almost mechanical in its efficiency. Severloh later described watching through his gun sight as American soldiers, despite taking terrible casualties, kept advancing. Officers led from the front and were cut down. NCOs rallied scattered troops and pushed forward. Medics ran into fire to treat wounded. The discipline and courage of the American soldiers shocked the German defenders, who'd been told these were soft, unmotivated conscripts. By midday on June 6th, German positions began reporting ammunition shortages that revealed a fundamental miscalculation in defensive planning. The Atlantic Wall's defensive calculations had assumed repelling a limited assault, perhaps 2 or 3 divisions attempting to establish a beachhead over 24-48 hours. Ammunition had been stockpiled accordingly. Positions were supplied for what planners estimated would be 3 days of intense combat. Nobody had planned for this scale of attack. Nobody had imagined that 5 full divisions would assault in the first wave, backed by unlimited naval fire support and complete air superiority. Positions with carefully calculated ammunition reserves exhausted them within hours. Artillery batteries, the backbone of the defensive system, faced catastrophic shortages. The German doctrine emphasized concentrated fire, massing artillery to destroy specific targets, but against an enemy with unlimited supplies, this approach failed. By afternoon, German artillery was rationed to 4 shells per gun per day. 4 shells. Against American destroyers that would fire hundreds of rounds at individual pillboxes without hesitation. The contrast revealed the fundamental difference between German and Allied approaches to war. Germany fought with careful husbandry of limited resources. The Allies fought with industrial abundance. American supply doctrine emphasized having far more ammunition than needed. Better to have surplus than shortage. German doctrine emphasized precision and conservation. Every shell had to count. Against an enemy that could afford to waste ammunition, German efficiency became irrelevant. Attempts to bring forward reserve ammunition failed catastrophically. Every road was under constant attack by Allied fighter bombers. Trucks that ventured out in daylight were destroyed. Even nighttime movement drew fire from aircraft equipped with searchlights and primitive but effective night vision equipment. The 21st Panzer Division represented Germany's best chance to throw the invasion back into the sea. This was Rommel's operational concept. Let the infantry and coastal fortifications slow the assault, then unleash mobile armored reserves to counterattack before the Allies could consolidate. But the 21st Panzer didn't receive orders to move until 10 a.m.,
4 hours after the landings began. Those 4 hours were fatal. When the division finally rolled toward the coast at 4:20 p.m., they advanced into a battlefield that had fundamentally changed. The Panzers actually reached the shoreline between Lyon-sur-Mer and Luc-sur-Mer around 7 p.m., the only German armored unit to accomplish this on D-Day. For a brief moment, breakthrough seemed possible. The Panzers could split the British forces, roll up the beaches, turn the invasion into the disaster German propaganda had promised. Then, at 9 p.m., the sky filled with aircraft again. Operation Mallard, 250 gliders bringing reinforcements and heavy equipment to the British 6th Airborne Division. German tank commanders, watching this aerial armada approaching, interpreted it as an airborne assault on their flanks and rear. Already exhausted, low on fuel and ammunition, they made the decision to withdraw. The 21st Panzer Division lost 54 tanks and armored vehicles on D-Day, roughly 25% of their strength, and accomplished nothing strategically. The counterattack that was supposed to save Germany had failed before it truly began. The division also encountered something they'd never seen before. Hobart's funnies, specialized British armor, including flail tanks for mine clearing, Churchill crocodiles with flamethrowers, and Churchill AVREs carrying massive petard mortars. These specialized vehicles represented a level of tactical innovation and industrial capacity that shocked German tank crews who'd considered themselves the masters of armored warfare.
By afternoon on June 6th, German command and control had effectively ceased to exist. Allied aircraft had systematically destroyed communication infrastructure in the weeks before D-Day. Telephone exchanges were bombed. Underground cables were severed by French resistance fighters activated by coded BBC messages. Radio communications were jammed by Allied electronic warfare units using techniques German signals intelligence couldn't counter. General Max Pemsel, Chief of Staff of the 7th Army, attempted to coordinate the defense from his headquarters at Le Mans, over 150 kilometers from the coast. His war diary records mounting frustration as entire divisions vanished from the communication network. Units reported enemy contact, then went silent. Contradictory reports flooded in. Some positions reported they were holding. Others reported being overrun. It became impossible to construct an accurate picture of the battlefield. Individual unit commanders made decisions in isolation, often directly contradicting orders from higher headquarters they never received. The rigid German command structure, which had worked brilliantly in earlier campaigns where communications remained intact, became a fatal liability. Officers trained to wait for orders from above simply froze when those orders never came. The Allies, by contrast, had trained their junior officers in NCOs to exercise initiative and make decisions independently. American and British doctrine emphasized decentralized command. When communications failed, local commanders pushed forward based on the overall mission rather than waiting for specific orders. This doctrinal difference, seemingly minor on paper, translated into decisive tactical advantages across the entire invasion front. As darkness fell, surviving German commanders took stock of a situation that defied their worst expectations. The Atlantic Wall had been breached in 5 separate locations. Allied forces were pushing inland. The Luftwaffe had been effectively absent. The Kriegsmarine had managed to sink exactly 1 destroyer, USS Corrie, while losing 15 E-boats and dozens of smaller craft. General Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Infantry Division that bore the brunt of the British assault at Sword Beach, sent a report that captured the scope of defeat. Divisional combat strength 35%. All coastal strongpoints lost. Artillery 90% destroyed. Enemy advancing inland. Reinforcements urgently needed. But no reinforcements were coming. Or rather, reinforcements were trying to reach Normandy, but were being systematically destroyed en route. Meanwhile, Allied logistics operated with stunning efficiency. LSTs, landing ship tank, continued to arrive in organized waves, disgorging entire armored regiments directly onto the beaches. Within 24 hours of the initial assault, the Allies were landing 15,000 tons of supplies daily,
more than the entire German army in Normandy consumed in a week. The beachhead that was supposed to be thrown back into the sea within hours was instead transforming into a permanent bridgehead, with industrial efficiency. Mulberry harbors, artificial ports, were already being assembled. Supply dumps were growing. The invasion wasn't just succeeding, it was becoming irreversible. What followed D-Day was Germany's systematic defeat in slow motion, each day bringing fresh evidence that the war was lost. German reinforcements attempting to reach Normandy encountered total interdiction of movement. The Allied air forces owned the skies so completely that daylight movement became suicidal. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, stationed near Toulouse, received orders to move to Normandy immediately. The journey should have taken 3 days. It took 17. Das Reich crept northward at night, hiding in forests during the day, constantly harassed by French resistance fighters and Allied fighter bombers. They arrived in Normandy having lost 30% of their vehicles and half their fuel supplies to air attack without firing a single shot at ground forces. The division that was supposed to be an elite strike force had been reduced to an exhausted remnant before entering battle. This pattern repeated across all German reinforcements. Units that should have reached the front in days took weeks. They arrived under strength, exhausted and demoralized, having lost their edge before even seeing the enemy. When Cherbourg fell on June 26th, after just 5 days of serious fighting, it delivered another psychological blow. This major port had been fortified for 4 years and garrisoned by 21,000 men. It was supposed to hold for months. General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, commanding the garrison, had proclaimed he would defend to the last bullet. Instead, he surrendered, explaining in post-war interrogation, quote, "Resistance became meaningless against unlimited enemy resources. We had ammunition for perhaps 2 more days. The enemy could bombard us indefinitely. I saw no point in sacrificing my men for nothing." End quote. This theme, the meaninglessness of resistance against unlimited resources, echoes throughout German accounts of Normandy. Beginning July 25th, Operation Cobra demonstrated Allied material superiority at its most devastating. The preparatory bombardment involved 1,507 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers, dropping over 4,100 tons of bombs on an area just 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep. The concentration of explosive force per square meter exceeded anything in military history to that point. General Fritz Bayerlen, commanding Panzer Division, an elite formation built around experienced tank crews and equipped with the best equipment Germany could provide, sent a report to Army Group B that captured the psychological impact. "My division is annihilated. I can no longer speak of combat strength. The psychological impact on survivors is undescribable. They are no longer soldiers, but broken men who jump at every sound." End quote. The bombardment was so intense that it killed Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater, observing from what was thought to be a safe distance behind friendly lines. If American generals weren't safe from their own firepower 3 miles from the target zone, what chance did German soldiers have at ground zero? The bombardment also revealed the terrible price of Allied material superiority. The preparatory bombardment was so concentrated that it fell partly on American positions, killing 111 American soldiers and wounding 490. The Americans accepted these casualties as the cost of overwhelming force. Germany couldn't afford such losses. The Allies could and did sacrifice their own men to ensure enemy destruction. The Falaise Pocket, August 12th to 21st, became where the German army in Normandy effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Approximately 10,000 Germans died in the pocket. 50,000 were captured. Over 300 tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed, along with 2,500 other vehicles. But these numbers don't capture the psychological impact on survivors. German soldiers attempting to escape described apocalyptic scenes. Roads carpeted with dead horses. Germany still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport while the Allies were fully motorized. Burning vehicles stretched for miles. Allied fighter bombers attacked in rotating waves every 20 minutes, allowing pilots no rest, but ensuring someone was overhead attacking anything that moved. Artillery fire fell continuously from batteries that never seemed to run out of shells. The systematic destruction was so complete that many German soldiers simply gave up, preferring captivity to certain death. Officers who'd sworn to fight to the last round surrendered with ammunition still available, recognizing that continued resistance was pointless slaughter rather than military necessity.
The Normandy Campaign's final statistics tell a story of complete German defeat. German losses from June 6 to August 31, 1944, was approximately 320,000 total casualties, 30,000 killed in action, 80,000 wounded, 210,000 missing or captured, 2,300 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed, virtually all armor in France, 2,127 aircraft lost. Allied losses: 209,672 total casualties, approximately 4,000 tanks lost, replaced within weeks, 4,101 aircraft lost from a force exceeding 13,000. But these numbers tell only part of the story. The critical difference lay in replacement capability. Allied losses were made good within days or weeks. German losses were irreplaceable. Every destroyed tank, every killed veteran, every lost aircraft represented permanent degradation of combat power. By September 1944, the German army in France had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. German professional military officers provided the most objective assessments of the Normandy disaster, and their conclusions were uniformly damning. General Heinrich Severloh, who assumed command in Normandy after Rommel was wounded, reported to OKW on August 1st. The enemy's material superiority is at least 20-1 in artillery, 10-1 in tanks, and absolute in aircraft. He can replace all losses within days. We cannot replace anything. Continued resistance can only delay, not prevent, ultimate defeat. General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, wrote in his 1949 memoir, "Normandy proved that courage alone could not overcome industrial supremacy. We faced an enemy who had mechanized not just warfare, but victory itself. They had turned war into an industrial process, and we were fighting with methods from an earlier age." Field Marshal Erwin Rommel left perhaps the most powerful testament to the Normandy experience. On July 15th, 2 days before being severely wounded when his staff car was strafed by Allied fighter bombers, he sent a final report to Hitler that stripped away all illusion. "The troops are fighting heroically everywhere, but the unequal struggle is nearing its end. The enemy's overwhelming superiority in men and material is beginning to tell. In the face of the enemy's complete command of the air, our own operations are hindered while the enemy can maneuver freely. Supply routes are constantly under attack. I must beg you to draw the necessary conclusions without delay." This was military language for complete defeat. Rommel, Germany's most celebrated field commander, was telling Hitler the war was lost and that continuing to fight served no military purpose, only political delusion. Hitler's response was to suspect Rommel of defeatism and to relieve him of command. Reality had become unacceptable to Nazi leadership. Normandy revealed that World War II had fundamentally become a production war, and German soldiers witnessed American industrial capacity that seemed to defy the laws of economics. Consider these comparative statistics. Ford's Willow Run plant alone produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production in 1944. American factories produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944. Germany managed 40,000. Allied ammunition expenditure in a single day of heavy combat exceeded German production capacity for an entire month. A single American infantry division consumed approximately 500 to 700 tons of supplies daily. An entire German corps, theoretically 3 divisions, consumed less than 300 tons daily. American logistics were so abundant that supplies were often discarded rather than transported back. German soldiers scavenging abandoned American positions were shocked to find functioning equipment and usable supplies simply left behind because bringing them forward was easier than recovering them. Hans von Luch, reflecting on Normandy in his memoir, wrote, "We learned that modern war was not about tactics or courage, but about production. The Americans had turned war into an industrial process. They didn't outfight us, they simply manufactured victory on assembly lines and shipped it across the Atlantic in unlimited quantities." This observation captures a fundamental truth. By 1944, the Allies had achieved such industrial superiority that they could accept inefficiency, waste, and even tactical defeats because strategic victory had become mathematically inevitable. German soldiers who survived Normandy were psychologically transformed by the experience. They had witnessed the complete invalidation of everything they'd been taught about warfare, racial superiority, and national destiny. Heinrich Severloh, the machine gunner of WN-62, spent the rest of his life haunted by June 6th. In his 2005 memoir, WN-62, Erinnerungen an Omaha Beach, he described meeting American D-Day veterans at memorial ceremonies decades later. "We embraced as old men who'd survived the same slaughterhouse. We all realized we'd been young men thrown into an industrial meat grinder. My 13,500 rounds meant nothing against their unlimited replacements. I killed men doing their duty, and they killed men doing theirs, and none of it mattered, because the outcome was decided by factories we never saw, by production statistics we couldn't comprehend." Friedrich von der Heydt, the German paratrooper commander, became a professor of international law after the war. He wrote extensively on Normandy's lessons. "Normandy taught us that the era of warrior heroes was finished. War had become a matter of industrial capacity and logistics, and we had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with horses and outdated dreams of martial glory. We were medieval knights charging against machine guns." D-Day from the German perspective was not merely a military defeat, it was a complete ideological and psychological collapse that shattered fundamental beliefs about warfare, national superiority, and historical destiny. German soldiers had been raised on Nazi ideology proclaiming racial superiority and the inevitable triumph of German will over decadent democracy. They had been told that democracies were weak, divided, and incapable of matching German discipline and fighting spirit. The sight of that armada on June 6th destroyed these beliefs instantly and permanently. This wasn't weakness. This represented organizational capacity, industrial power, and democratic determination that exceeded everything Nazi ideology had prepared them to expect. The soldiers who defended Normandy's beaches discovered that courage, training, and tactical skill, attributes they possessed in abundance, had become irrelevant variables in an equation dominated by industrial production. They'd brought warrior spirit to an industrial battle and been crushed by the mathematics of modern warfare. Heinrich Severloh began June 6, 1944, believing the invasion would be thrown back into the sea within hours, just as propaganda had promised. He ended that day surrounded by thousands of empty shell casings, his hands blistered, his hearing permanently damaged. Watching endless waves of Allied reinforcements land on the beach his position was supposed to control absolutely. His experience embodied the larger German tragedy. Tactical proficiency rendered meaningless by strategic impossibility. The beaches of Normandy became not just a battlefield, but a revelation. A place where German soldiers witnessed the future of warfare and recognized it belonged to nations that could produce the most material and apply it most efficiently. All the courage, all the training, all the tactical brilliance Germany possessed couldn't overcome Allied industrial supremacy. In trying to hold back the Allied invasion, the German defenders might as well have been trying to hold back the tide itself. They fired until their gun barrels melted from heat. They fought until their ammunition was exhausted. They held positions until naval gunfire obliterated them. And the Allies simply brought more of everything. More men, more ammunition, more ships, more aircraft, more supplies in an infinite stream that seemed to have no end. The mathematics of modern industrial warfare had rendered German courage strategically irrelevant.
The German soldiers who faced D-Day learned history's cruelest lesson. In the age of industrial warfare, nations that cannot match their enemy's production capacity are doomed to defeat, regardless of their soldiers' skill, bravery, or sacrifice. Military excellence becomes meaningless when the enemy can afford to trade 3 tanks for 1, 10 aircraft for 1, 20 soldiers for 1, and still maintain numerical superiority. They began June 6th as warriors of the Third Reich, confident in their superior training, weapons, and positions. They ended it as traumatized witnesses to democracy's industrial might deployed at full, terrifying efficiency. The invasion they had promised to destroy in hours had swept them aside in days, carrying with it the last realistic possibility of German victory, and leaving only the bitter recognition of a truth they could no longer deny. They had been fighting mathematics with mythology, industrial capacity with ideological fervor, production statistics with tactical brilliance. And in modern warfare, mathematics always prevails. The lesson of D-Day from the German perspective was brutal and complete. In industrial warfare, the side that can build more, ship more, and replace more wins. Everything else, courage, training, fortifications, tactical skill, becomes historically irrelevant.